June 8, 1944. The beaches of Normandy. 2 days after the largest amphibious invasion in human history, the fighting was far from over. While the world celebrated the successful D-Day landings, thousands of American soldiers were still locked in brutal combat with entrenched German forces just miles inland from the blood-soaked beaches. In a small village near Grandcamp-Maisy, a single American private was about to do something that would seem impossible. With his rifle jammed and useless, he would charge headlong into fortified German positions. What happened next would earn him America's highest military honor and become one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in World War II. This is the story of Frank Peregory. I'm Frank Dawson. Before we dive into this story, please give this video a like. It really helps push the video to more viewers and supports the channel. Frank Dominic Peregory was born on March 10, 1920, in Charlottesville, Virginia. He wasn't a man who sought glory. He wasn't a career soldier dreaming of medals and recognition. Frank was an ordinary young American, the kind of man you'd find in any small town across the country during that era. Standing at average height with a lean build, Frank had grown up during the Great Depression. Like millions of other young men of his generation, he understood hard work, sacrifice, and duty. These weren't just words to men like Frank Peregory. They were the values that defined their lives. Before the war, Frank worked as a skilled laborer. He was known in his community as reliable, quiet, and dependable. Friends and family would later describe him as soft-spoken, but determined. He wasn't the type to boast or draw attention to himself. When Frank said he'd do something, you could count on it getting done. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Frank was 21 years old. Like millions of other young Americans, he felt the call to serve. The nation was at war, and Frank Peregory wasn't the kind of man to sit on the sidelines while others fought for freedom. He enlisted in the United States Army and was assigned to the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Infantry Division. The 29th was known as the Blue and Gray Division, a tribute to its composition of soldiers from both northern and southern states. This was a National Guard division with deep roots in American military tradition, tracing its lineage back to the Civil War. The 29th Infantry Division had a tough reputation to uphold, and the training was grueling. Frank and his fellow soldiers underwent extensive preparation in the United States and then in England. They trained for amphibious assaults, urban combat, and the kind of brutal, close-quarters fighting they would face in the hedgerows of Normandy. By early 1944, Frank had been promoted to Private First Class. He was a rifleman in Company K, 3rd Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment. His weapon was the M1 Garand, the semi-automatic rifle that would become legendary in the hands of American infantrymen. The Garand was a remarkable weapon for its time, accurate, reliable, and capable of sustained fire. But like any mechanical device, it could malfunction at the worst possible moment. As spring turned to early summer in 1944, Frank and the entire 29th Infantry Division knew something big was coming. The buildup of forces in England was impossible to ignore. Ships, planes, tanks, and hundreds of thousands of men were being assembled for what everyone knew would be the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. Frank Peregory wrote letters home to Charlottesville. In them, he remained characteristically modest about what lay ahead. He told his family not to worry, that he'd do his duty and come home when the job was done. These letters, like those of countless other American soldiers, carried the weight of uncertainty. Every man wondered if his next letter would be his last. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the 29th Infantry Division played a crucial role in the invasion of Normandy. The 116th Infantry Regiment was assigned to assault Omaha Beach, the most heavily defended of all the landing zones. Omaha Beach would become synonymous with sacrifice and courage. The German defenders, positioned on high bluffs overlooking the beach, had created a killing zone. As landing craft doors dropped and American soldiers poured out into chest-deep water, they were met with a devastating wall of machine gun and artillery fire. The 116th Infantry Regiment took catastrophic casualties that morning. Companies were reduced to fractions of their strength within minutes of hitting the beach. The sand was soon littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, and the water ran red with American blood. But through extraordinary courage and determination, the survivors pressed forward, scaled the bluffs, and established a foothold on French soil. Frank Peregory survived D-Day. While the exact details of his actions on June 6th aren't fully documented, we know he made it off Omaha Beach and pushed inland with his unit. The fact that he survived that first terrible day was itself remarkable. More than 2,000 American casualties occurred on Omaha Beach alone, but surviving D-Day was just the beginning. The popular image of the Normandy invasion often ends with the successful beach landings, but for the soldiers on the ground, the real war was just starting. The Germans weren't retreating. They were dug in, determined to make the Americans pay for every yard of French soil. The terrain of Normandy was a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. The region was covered in bocage, the ancient Norman hedgerows that divided the countryside into countless small fields. These hedgerows weren't like the neat, trimmed hedges you might see in an English garden. They were massive earthen walls, sometimes 6 feet high and just as thick, topped with dense vegetation that had been growing for centuries. Each hedgerow-enclosed field became its own little battlefield. German machine gun teams could hide behind these natural fortifications, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned every advance into a deadly gamble. Snipers found perfect concealment in the thick vegetation. Mortar teams could rain death from hidden positions. For the American infantry, it was exhausting, terrifying work. You'd fight to take one field, only to face another identical challenge 100 yards away. The casualty rates were staggering, and progress was measured in yards, not miles. By June 8th, the 29th Infantry Division had pushed several miles inland from Omaha Beach. Frank Peregory's unit was operating near the area between Grandcamp-Maisy and Isigny-sur-Mer. This was still close to the coast, but it was contested ground where German forces were determined to hold every position. The weather had turned poor. The hedgerows were slick with rain and mud. Visibility was limited. Communication between units was difficult. In this confused, chaotic environment, small unit actions often determined success or failure. Individual soldiers, acting on their own initiative, could change the outcome of an entire day's fighting. Frank Peregory was about to become one of those soldiers. On the morning of June 8, 1944, Company K of the 116th Infantry Regiment was tasked with advancing through the Norman countryside near Grandcamp-Maisy. Intelligence reports indicated German forces in the area, but the exact strength and position of the enemy were unclear. This was typical of the hedgerow fighting. You rarely knew what you were facing until bullets started flying. Frank Peregory's platoon was moving cautiously through the maze of hedgerows when they suddenly came under intense fire. German machine guns opened up from concealed positions, and the Americans immediately dove for cover. The distinctive sound of the MG-42 German machine gun, so fast it sounded like ripping fabric, filled the air. Bullets snapped overhead and kicked up dirt all around the pinned-down Americans. The Germans had chosen their position well. They were dug in behind a hedgerow with excellent fields of fire, and they'd had time to prepare their defenses. The American advance ground to a halt. Men pressed themselves into the earth, trying to become as small as possible, as machine gun bursts swept the area. This was the reality of infantry combat in Normandy. It wasn't the dramatic, fast-moving warfare you see in movies. It was slow, grinding, and terrifying. Pinned down by superior firepower, soldiers could do little but hug the ground and hope artillery or tanks would arrive to blast the enemy position. But Frank Peregory wasn't content to wait. From his position, he could see that his entire platoon was in danger. The Germans had them in a kill zone. If they stayed pinned down, it was only a matter of time before German mortars or a flanking movement would turn bad into catastrophic. Frank made a decision. He would assault the German position. He raised himself up from his cover and began moving forward, his M1 Garand rifle at the ready. The other soldiers watched in amazement. What was Peregory doing? This was suicide. You didn't charge fortified machine gun positions alone. Frank moved quickly, using what little cover the terrain offered. He was trying to get close enough to use his grenades, the only weapons that could effectively neutralize a dug-in machine gun position. His heart was pounding. The roar of gunfire was deafening. Every instinct screamed at him to get down, to take cover, to survive. He raised his rifle to return fire at the German position, to keep their heads down while he advanced. He pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. Frank pulled the trigger again. Still nothing. His M1 Garand, the reliable weapon he'd trained with for months, had jammed. In the worst possible moment, in the middle of a battlefield, his rifle was useless. Most men would have retreated at this point. The charge was already suicidal, with a working weapon. Without one, it was simply insane. Frank had every reason to fall back, to seek cover, to let someone else take the risk. But Frank Peregory didn't retreat. He didn't even hesitate. If his rifle wouldn't fire, he'd use what he had. He had grenades on his belt. He had the bayonet fixed to his useless rifle. And he had something perhaps more important than any weapon, an unwavering determination to save his fellow soldiers. Frank kept moving forward. What happened next would be talked about for decades among the survivors of the 116th Infantry Regiment. Frank Peregory, with a jammed rifle and nothing but grenades and a bayonet, charged directly at fortified German positions. The Germans saw him coming. How could they not? A lone American soldier running at them across open ground. They directed fire at him, but Frank kept moving, whether through incredible luck, divine intervention, or simply the confusion of battle. The German bullets missed their mark. Frank reached the first hedgerow where German soldiers were positioned. He pulled a grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, and hurled it over the earthen wall. The explosion was followed by screams. Before the Germans could recover, Frank was over the hedgerow, his bayonet forward. Close quarters combat with a bayonet is brutal and primal. There's nothing clean or distant about it. You're close enough to see your enemy's face, to smell him, to hear his breathing. It requires not just physical strength, but an almost superhuman level of aggression and determination. Frank fought hand-to-hand with German soldiers in that first position. His bayonet did its terrible work. Some Germans fell. Others, shocked by the ferocity of this lone American's attack, began to surrender. But Frank didn't stop. He could see more German positions ahead, more machine guns that threatened his comrades. With Germans from the first position, now prisoners or casualties, he moved on to the next. Again, he used his grenades. Again, he went in with his bayonet. The Germans were completely unprepared for this kind of attack. Their doctrine and training emphasized coordinated defense and firepower. They weren't prepared for a single, seemingly crazed American soldier who wouldn't stop coming. Word began to spread among the German defenders. There was something terrifying about Frank's assault. It wasn't just his courage, it was the relentless, unstoppable nature of his advance. He seemed like a force of nature rather than a single man. Frank cleared a second position, then a third. Each time, German soldiers fell or surrendered. The Americans who had been pinned down minutes earlier now watched in stunned disbelief. Their quiet, unassuming comrade had somehow turned into an unstoppable warrior. By now, Frank had been fighting continuously for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. He was exhausted. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the cool Norman weather. His hands were slick with blood, some of it German, some of it his own from minor wounds he'd sustained in the close combat. But the German defense was breaking. Seeing position after position fall to this lone American, and hearing the screams and explosions, other German soldiers began to lose their will to fight. Some started to emerge with their hands up, calling out, "Kamerad!" the German word for comrade, but used to indicate surrender. Frank's fellow soldiers, no longer pinned down, now moved forward to support him. They began rounding up the surrendering Germans. The count was astonishing. In his single-handed assault, Frank Peregory had killed at least 8 German soldiers in close combat. He had wounded several more, and he had forced approximately 35 to 40 German soldiers to surrender. One man, a jammed rifle, grenades and a bayonet, and sheer, indomitable will. As the dust settled and the shooting stopped, Frank Peregory's fellow soldiers surrounded him. They couldn't quite believe what they'd just witnessed. Even in a war full of acts of courage, what Frank had done was extraordinary. His platoon sergeant immediately began compiling a report. This kind of action couldn't go unrecognized. Officers who heard about the incident were equally amazed. In the chaos and confusion of the Normandy campaign, Frank's assault stood out as something special. But Frank himself seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. He downplayed what he'd done. He'd just done what needed to be done, he said. His buddies were pinned down. Someone had to do something. It was that simple to him. This humility was characteristic of so many of the greatest heroes of World War II. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as soldiers doing their jobs. The concept of leaving your friends to die while you stayed safe was simply unthinkable to men like Frank Peregory. The German prisoners were processed and sent to the rear. Many of them seemed relieved to be out of the fight. Some looked at Frank with expressions that mixed fear and respect. This lone American had done what an entire company might have struggled to accomplish. Frank's immediate concern was his rifle. He finally had time to examine why it had jammed. The exact cause isn't recorded in official documents, but M1 Garand rifles could malfunction for various reasons: a bent clip, a stuck cartridge, dirt in the action, or simply bad luck. Whatever the cause, it had forced Frank to do the impossible with the most basic weapons a soldier carried. The 116th Infantry Regiment's advance continued. Frank returned to his squad, and they pushed forward to the next objective. There was no time for celebration or reflection. The war demanded that they keep moving, keep fighting. But among the men of Company K, Frank Peregory's name was now spoken with something approaching awe. They'd seen what he could do. They knew that if they got in trouble again, Frank Peregory was the kind of man you wanted beside you. The fighting in Normandy continued to be brutal. Every day brought new challenges, new dangers, new casualties. The 29th Infantry Division pushed deeper into France, but the Germans fought for every inch. On June 14, 1944, just 6 days after his extraordinary assault near Grandcamp-Maisy, Frank Peregory was killed in action. The exact circumstances of his death aren't fully detailed in available records. What we know is that he died doing what he'd done throughout the campaign, fighting as an infantryman, facing danger alongside his comrades. Frank was 24 years old. He'd been in combat for just 8 days since D-Day. In that brief time, he'd proven himself to be one of the bravest soldiers in an army full of brave men. News of Frank's death reached his family in Charlottesville, Virginia. Like thousands of other American families during the war, they received the telegram that every family dreaded. Their son, their Frank, wouldn't be coming home. But what they didn't know yet was that Frank's actions on June 8th had been officially recognized at the highest levels. His commanding officers had submitted a recommendation that Frank Peregory receive the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration for valor in combat. The Medal of Honor isn't given lightly. The criteria are strict. The act of valor must be performed in action against an enemy of the United States. It must involve personal bravery or self-sacrifice so conspicuous as to clearly distinguish the individual above his comrades, and it must involve risk of life. Frank Peregory's actions on June 8, 1944, met all these criteria and more. The official Medal of Honor citation reads in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." On the 8th of June, 1944, the 3rd Battalion was advancing on the strongly held German defenses at Grandcamp-Maisy, France, when the leading elements were suddenly halted by a vicious crossfire from machine gun emplacements. Private First Class Peregory, without regard for his own safety, voluntarily advanced alone toward the enemy strong point, armed with only his rifle and grenades. Citation continues to describe how, when his rifle jammed, Frank continued his assault with grenades and his bayonet, killing 8 enemy soldiers and capturing approximately 35 others. On February 23, 1945, 8 months after Frank's death, the Medal of Honor was officially awarded to Private First Class Frank D. Peregory. The medal was presented to his family in a ceremony in Charlottesville. For Frank's parents and loved ones, the medal was both an honor and a heartbreak. They were immensely proud of what their son had done, of the courage he'd shown, of the lives he'd saved. But no medal, no matter how prestigious, could bring Frank back. The Medal of Honor came with Frank's name engraved on it, but Frank himself never knew he'd received it. He died not knowing that his country's highest honor would bear his name. He died simply as a soldier doing his duty. Today, Frank D. Peregory's name is remembered in several ways. In Charlottesville, Virginia, his hometown, his sacrifice is commemorated. The local American Legion post bears his name, ensuring that future generations will know of his courage. At the Normandy American Cemetery in France, where thousands of white crosses and stars of David mark the graves of Americans who fell in the liberation of Europe, Frank's sacrifice is remembered along with his fallen comrades. But perhaps the most important legacy is the story itself. The story of what one determined man can accomplish when the stakes are highest. Frank Peregory's actions on June 8, 1944, remind us that heroism isn't about seeking glory or recognition. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when everything screams at you to take cover, to let someone else do it, to survive at any cost. Frank saw his friends in danger. He saw an enemy that needed to be defeated. And when his weapon failed him, he didn't use that as an excuse. He used what he had: grenades, a bayonet, and courage that wouldn't quit. Military historians and tacticians still study Frank's assault. From a purely tactical standpoint, what he did shouldn't have worked. A single infantryman charging fortified positions should result in that soldier's death, not victory. But Frank succeeded because he combined surprise, aggression, and an unwavering determination that the Germans simply weren't prepared for. His actions saved the lives of countless soldiers in his platoon who were pinned down. By breaking the German defense, he allowed the American advance to continue. In the grand scheme of the Normandy campaign, it was a small action. But to the men whose lives Frank saved that day, it was everything. Frank Peregory's story is part of the larger story of the Normandy campaign and World War II. The 29th Infantry Division, which Frank served in, went on to fight across France, into Germany, and all the way to the end of the war in Europe. The division suffered over 20,000 casualties during the war, more than twice its original strength. These numbers represent lives cut short, families devastated, and a generation that paid an enormous price for freedom. The soldiers who fought in Normandy faced conditions that are hard for us to fully comprehend today. The physical exhaustion, the constant fear, the loss of friends, the uncertainty of survival, these were daily realities. Yet they persevered, they did their duty, and men like Frank Peregory showed courage that still inspires us decades later. It's important to remember that Frank was just one of millions. While his actions were extraordinary enough to earn the Medal of Honor, there were countless other acts of courage, large and small, that went unrecognized. Every soldier who landed on those beaches, who fought through those hedgerows, who faced death and kept going, they all deserve our respect and remembrance. Normandy succeeded because of men like Frank Peregory. Not grand strategy or superior weapons, but individual soldiers who found the courage to do the impossible. Private First Class Frank Peregory was born in Charlottesville, Virginia in 1920. An ordinary man until extraordinary times called him to service. On D-Day, he landed on Omaha Beach. 2 days later, his rifle jammed under fire. He didn't retreat. He didn't freeze. With only grenades and a bayonet, he charged uphill and defeated an entrenched enemy force. 6 days after that, he gave his life for his country. He was 24 years old. Frank never sought recognition. He simply did what was right when his friends needed him most. But we remember him. We honor him. And we tell his story so future generations know what courage truly means. When you face something impossible, remember Frank Peregory. The most extraordinary things are accomplished by ordinary people who refuse to quit. Frank's rifle jammed on June 8, 1944. But his courage never did. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered. These men and their sacrifices should never be forgotten.